Yeah, benvenuto. Welcome to our symposium on issues on the measurement of social hierarchy. The first talk is by Tuashu. He is a researcher at the University of Edinburgh and will present research on dominance traits.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for putting together this symposium. Move this back to where it was. Yeah. And bear with me, my speaker notes on my laptop. Right, so yes, my name is Drew, and I'm going to be talking to you today about dominance traits, central factors in understanding social disparities. This is work I've been doing with Adam Moore at the University of Edinburgh for the last few years. Yeah. Okay. So my background, where I've come to this place in my career, is I started out as a biologist, particularly in evolution and ecology, and also in anthropology, particularly evolutionary anthropology. And one of the things that anthropologists focus on is sociality. And sociality isn't unique to humans, of course. We find it in any kind of group living animals. That's sort of the definition of what being social is. And anytime you have social living creatures, you have hierarchies, essentially. That's a given. If you live in a group, there's going to be some kind of dominance hierarchy. And dominance hierarchies systems rely on having a method for an individual to establish some degree of dominance in that group. And then there's the ability for them to maintain that dominance in that group as well. And so I want to introduce this because I want us to take us back to briefly just to where hierarchy, class, social status all begins, which is with our primate ancestors. So humans are primates. This is a clear fact. But we don't experience dominance hierarchies in the strict way that other species do. Instead, humans seem to have a kind of generalizable ability, a generalizable cognitive ability, to judge individuals based on their relative rank, given various circumstances. But we haven't strayed like so far. So for example, if you go look at an ape, you look at a chimpanzee, take that for instance. A chimpanzee might sort of be aware, well, it wouldn't be aware exactly that it is, say, the third ranked individual. That might be true in our methods, in our models. It might be true that that individual is number 3, and let's say that their sibling is the number 2. They probably, however, don't think in those kinds of numeric symbolic terms. But in most cases, we don't think in those terms either. So we might know that our supervisor is ranked above us, but we would have to think about that. And we also wouldn't be aware of exactly where we are ranked compared to the supervisor. And we don't know what that supervisor's rank is compared to their other supervisor. We don't have numbers that we immediately assign to these individuals. And there are, of course, exceptions to this too. If you look in, again, in the anthropological literature, if you live in a society with like a king or a chief in a traditional society, you get a little extra info that individual is going to be the number 1. But even this is not actually very useful or applicable information because you're not going to interact with this individual in most cases. But again, I want to emphasize that context is quite important here. So again, if you think about, say, your supervisor, they might have a higher rank in the workplace, but you might be a very socially assertive person outside of the workplace. And if you're outside of the workplace, at the pub, at the coffee shop, something like that, someone who doesn't know about your in-work relationship might see you two interacting and assume that you might be the more important person than your supervisor, if your supervisor is, say, more reserved. So again, there's not a clear rank relationship here that transfers across all circumstances. It's quite circumstantial. So ultimately for humans, rank is a very kind of nebulous, very hard to get at concept. Which brings me back to dominance. So what do I mean when I say dominance? I've been talking about dominance, I've been talking about rank, hierarchies, and so I'd like to get a bit more concrete. When I say dominance, I'm referring to a personality trait, usually stable personality trait of having high social control, particularly in the context of vertical personality, interpersonal interactions. This isn't a universal definition. It can also refer to motives and strategies. Both the motivational psychology fields, social psychology and evolutionary psychology fields use dominance for similar but related, but yet distinct terms. And there are some key differences here between how they get defined in different fields. The dominance traits that we have also are quite similar to what you will find in primates. In both primates and humans, we assume that the personality trait of dominance is quite stable, but that isn't necessarily a given. We know from research of people like Brent Roberts that this trait in humans will increase over time. And that's actually quite similar to what you find in many apes, particularly female apes. The males have quite a different system, but the females, they'll start in the middle or down below, and as they get older, they'll just rise in rank, and they'll also rise in dominance as well at the same time. So age is a major factor here, and that's just another important circumstantial effect. So the important thing here is that dominance, it does have trait-like aspects to it, but things change. An individual's motives might change. Motives are certainly circumstantial. And so in our work, in my work, it's important to recognize that we don't always have the full understanding of what's going on. And this is quite an early stage to be studying these issues. And to be honest, we don't know that much about this because there are very complicated genetic and phenotypic issues wrapped up in this as well. And that's quite a challenge. So then I'd like to get back to connecting the two, dominance and rank. How are they related? Well, so speaking again about circumstances, the most important circumstances that we have in our social lives as humans are arguably our socioeconomic circumstances. So as I said, we don't really have a single rank, but what we do have is we have things like social class, occupational prestige, SES, and so on. And these things can change as well. And it's worth noting, I think, that much of the personality literature that's looked at these sorts of things tends to look just at the big five. That's big five. That's starting to change. But dominance has been around for a long time, but there's been simply a lot less focus on it. Nevertheless, that does seem to be an association, and there seems to be a kind of through line from how our primate ancestors associate their dominance with their rank, with how our dominance is associated with our social status as well. But we know that dominance is associated with an individual's income, even their education. So we have this kind of connecting through line between these trait level personality things that we can measure and these rank variables that are relatively easy to measure in primates, but not so easy to measure in humans. I think this may come with little surprise. I think it makes intuitive sense. A dominant person will want to control resources, and they'll want to have the resources to be able to control others. It's also, I think, worth noting that this doesn't rule out the direct effect that other personality variables have, like conscientiousness. Obviously, a conscientious person also is probably going to have higher income and do higher education, but these are different pathways. Okay, so to get into more detail, I'd like to talk about kind of what are the main dominance constructs that are being worked with at this time. So again, I have a personality background, so I'm going to start there. So obviously, there's just constructs labeled dominance, but there's also assertiveness, a little bit different, but quite similar. Social boldness, social potency, confidence, leadership, status seeking. And all these things, sometimes they're a part of extroversion, sometimes they're distinct from extroversion. But I think you can see how there may be something going on that's common here. And I'm going to come back to this question of what is the common underlying construct in a little bit. Okay, and then if we go beyond the personality and trait psychology area, if you go look at what they call strategies, there's a dominance and prestige strategy that have been quite prevalent in the literature with evolutionary psychology. And then motivational psychology, there's the power motive. And the power motive has recently been broken down into dominance, prestige, and leadership, sub-motives of the power motive. And then there's some outcomes too. Good example of an outcome is perceived social status, which can be measured a few different ways. One of which is like the MacArthur social ladder, where you get a picture of a ladder and asked to basically place yourself. Where do you think you are relative to the rest of your society? And then that seems to be a pretty good proxy for what people think their rank is. Now, so we have all these different constructs. What actually distinguishes them? Well, so I'm going to get into a little bit some definitions. So personality, a lot of the adjectives that would be used to define these include assertive, dominant, self-confident, outspoken. If we look at items, some common descriptors might be, I want to be the very best, or I wait for others to lead the way. That one would be negatively loaded on a dominance dimension. For strategies, so this is from some of Whitaker's work, which relates to Cheng's work. Dominance, a common item is, I'm often trying to get my way regardless of what people may want. Prestige might be, I'm considered an expert on some matters. And then the motivational approach, dominance might be described by, I try to control others rather than permit them to control me. And prestige might be, I'm happy when I present my achievements to others, whereas leadership could be defined by, I like to be in charge of others. So there are different questions here, but I think we can see that the way these faculties are being assessed, they all use questionnaire items with Likert scales, and there's quite a bit of similarity here. Once we get down to the level of actual measurement, there's a lot going on here that's happening in common. And that's even true of outcomes too. Apart from the latter, a lot of the ways you measure social class, it's just asking people questions and having them rate them on a 1 to 5, 1 to 6 scale. So that gets me to some research questions. First off, what I wanted to understand is there a general factor of dominance underlying all these constructs? What are the discernible subfactors of dominance? And then what are the wider correlates of dominance, trying to understand the bigger nomological net. So first study I want to talk about, we used the Eugene Springfield community sample. That's a Lou Goldberg study has been running from 1994. Started with about 1,000 people. It's been shrinking over time. And that study has brought in a huge number of different instruments, and they've assessed dominance, social potency, assertiveness, leadership, confidence, ambition, prestige staking, just to name a few. And in many cases, they have multiple dominance, multiple leadership measures from different inventories with the same people. These are some of the inventories. You've probably heard of some of these, maybe some of them you haven't. So what I did was we did this CFA omega analysis. Yes.
Just can you show us?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Yes, take it in. Everyone good? Yeah, okay. So we did a CFA in the style of an omega analysis. So we tried to partial out the effects of a general factor and then looked for the best fitting model with different specific factors as well. And I should say, the data collection here was, the data was already collected, so we didn't pre-register that, but all the analyses are pre-registered for this study. And for the next study, the data collection and the analyses are pre-registered. So what we found is that there's a strong bifactor here. 59% of the common variance in all of these measures can be defined, can be captured by this general factor. And then the best fit model, and it does fit okay, you get 9 individual factors, but the loadings are quite small. They're quite kind of few, and you can see this just like one loading. So they're quite difficult to interpret, and I have not been able to interpret them in any particular way. Some cases it looks like there's some kind of, common instrument effect going on, like the IPIP ones are on the same, the HPI variables are on the same. So it's hard to know what to make of that. But then in terms of the wider network of associations, we wanted to look, basically we took it that big general factor, brought it out and looked at some of the many other constructs that the Eugene Springfield sample has measured. To see what might be in common. And so obviously, yes, dominant people tend to be extroverted. They tend to seek status and achievement. They tend to be more masculine, less feminine. They tend to be less timid, more narcissistic, more and impressionistic, but not particularly worried about impression management, more Machiavellian. So ultimately you get quite a bit of dark triad going on here, as well as self-deceiving, but it isn't all negative. They also have high self-esteem and high locus of control, but also low modesty and greed avoidance. So if we look at all these classic measures, basically what we're finding is they're kind of tapping the same thing. There's a little bit of variation here, but it's pretty much the same thing that all of these classic instruments are measuring. But then there's been quite a proliferation recently of more recent, often top-down design scales trying to capture specific aspects. But there's still a problem in the literature because there's a huge proliferation and too many of these scales. So there's not as many. There's about a dozen constructs that I was able to find in the literature. So I brought all of these together and did some data collection to compare them and analyze them in a similar way. So again, this is a list of the main dominance, prestige, and leadership factors and instruments that we used. Anyone want to take a look? They're not as well known as the other ones, but you might recognize some of them. Anyone want more time? All right. Okay. And we used a population representative sample from both the US and the UK, totaling about 650 people. And again, we found a strong common bifactor. 42% of the common variance could be explained. Not as high as 59%, but still quite strong. But there were at least some discriminable subfactors. We found one for leadership and assertiveness. Those tended to load together in what we sometimes have been terming group dominance. There's sort of been a forcefulness and aggressiveness subfactor, which I'm referring to as dyadic dominance sometimes. And then there was a little prestige factor. So I want to note, many of the instruments out there that say they're measuring prestige really tend to be measuring leadership or group dominance. So if we look at the broader network as well, that leadership factor and then the general factor really quite closely aligned. Those forceful dominant individuals, that tends to be associated with short-term maintenance strategies, all kinds of aggression, as well as low coalition building and what is called low social honor as well. Then prestige is associated with positive high coalition building, more long-term maintenance strategies, but also a specific kind of reactive aggression. And then leadership tends to associate with physical activity, physical strength, perceived status, and fewer risk-taking attitudes. Okay, so in conclusion, it seems like there is a strong single factor of dominance, maybe power seeking, whatever you'd like to call it. But there's a single general trait here that is significantly also linked to relevant behaviors and outcomes. All of those older inventories are generally measuring the same thing. So you might look at something that's called dominance. You might look at something called leadership from some of these old inventories. And there will be, the leadership one will have mostly leadership items on it, but it will also have 2, 3 prestige or dominance items. And the dominance one will be slightly more loaded towards dominance. But there'll be leadership items in there as well sometimes, and we just can't really distinguish between those things. I hoped that the general factor would come out and we would be able to distinguish these, but that simply doesn't seem to be happening. But we do have a pretty good characterization of that generally dominant individual, and they tend to have higher social status, more social capital, tend to be physically strong, and they also have this tendency to behave in what has been characterized by von Ruyden, for example, in a ruthless, self-advancing manner, which is consistent with what he calls a coercive style of leadership. But these newer traits, they have been better designed, they've been thought out a little bit more clearly, and they do have the ability to break down the bigger factors into meaningful sub-factors of leadership, prestige, dominance, and there may be others out there as well. And I'd like to particularly note that the best of those inventories out there is probably from Sussenbach. That one is relatively new, but it's been very thoroughly validated. It's good face validity, it's good external validity as well. And it has the best psychometric characteristics for actually getting at all 3 of these things independently, while also allowing you to measure general dominance, if that's what you're interested in. Okay, thank you. I don't know if we're doing questions now or at the end, but.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting. I saw you used the TIT, thematic
yes.
perception test. Have you found any link between this projective test and your research?
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. I missed it in my notes. Yes, so that the need for power that comes out of the TAT is not associated with any of these explicit measures at all. There's just, it's not that there's a low correlation. There is no significant correlation between that implicit measure and any of the explicit measures.
Yes, very nice talk, very interesting. You define dominance as a trait that is characterized by striving for social control, and then you separate it from the dominance motive. But do you think it's the same? What's different, the dominance motive and dominance as trait? Because, with prestige, for example, I think there's a difference. So if you have prestige, you not necessarily strive for influence through prestige, but for dominance, maybe the case.
So there's a sort of undeniable fact I keep finding in the data that people who tend to strive for prestige also tend to be the people who strive for dominance, at least a little bit. Like there's a baseline correlation there that's hard to get past. And so I don't think the motives are exactly the same. I just think that the people who tend to be one do tend to be the other. And I think that it is also hard to tease apart. It's really hard to tease that kind of trait level value out of those motives. It's just, and particularly like with the TAT thing, it's like, it's hard to know then what is implicit, what is explicit, and what is the difference between those, and what does it mean that it's hard to find a connection there. Hope that clarifies a bit.
Yeah, I also don't know that.
Yeah, I don't think anyone has a good answer to this at the moment. Yeah.
I've got another question. In fact, you used the 5-factor model 2, and each from the 5-factor got facets, 6 facets, and with the exploration, there is one facet. His name is dominance. Did you have found any link between these facets and your models?
It's assertiveness is the neo facet. It's here. Yeah, there it is. Assertiveness neo. So it's in there.
NO from the NeoP?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So that's the 1 of 6 of extroversion facets. Yeah.
Thanks very much for all those questionnaires. It's really good. And the other way, you say that that's the questionnaire side of things, the personality. There's also the questionnaire process, I guess, with the, what do you actually call that bit? Is it the prestige with those areas? What is that mix of things?
I would call them, I think, motives.
So it's a motive.
Yeah.
Okay. And so it was just a thought I had, was that some of the actually more popular tools out there are labeled DISC tools, D-I-S-C, and the D is dominance. Curiously, I don't know whether there's been any consideration of putting those in the mix, or even if there's any research which suggests that is the D really measuring D in this case.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about a lot of different instruments. I guess those weren't in the Goldberg sample. If they were, I think I would have picked them up. I mean, I suspect, just on the basis of what we have here, I would suspect that it is measuring dominance. It's probably like, it's a vague general sense of dominance. That's kind of what every tool seems to be getting at, unless it's really specifically tailored.
So I know that is, I mean, for people who are something quick in the workplace, some of those sort of short circuit. Oh, D, great. You want a high D for leaders? It's that sort of quick, link, whatever. So I was just interested in if it had been in examples.
Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. We have our second talk. The second talk is online. That's
Okay. Okay, you can, Didi, you can share your screen now. And you are unmute, perfect. Perfect.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm
We'll
sharing
share
my
your
screen in a
screen.
moment.
So
Okay.
No, she's when she's.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect. Great. Yeah, the second talk is by Didina. She is employed at University of Melbourne in Australia and will present research on scale development and validation of the hedonic and eudaimonic power motive scales.
Thank you so much, Robert. Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to my presentation. So today I'm going to be discussing a scale development paper, which is on power motivation, and I'm working on this project with Jen Overbeck and Nicole Mead at the University of Melbourne and the University of York. So I'll begin by giving you an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So first, I'll present the rationale for the project, and then the power motivation theory, which we came up with, and then I'll walk through the scale development process with you. So since it's the running theme in today's presentation, I'll first define power in the context of this research. So power is a symmetric control over valued resources. That is, if you have power, it gives you the ability to control outcomes for yourself and for others. Now on to the rationale. So the man on your screen is Nelson Mandela. As a young man, he came to power by leading a movement of freedom fighters for the liberation of Black people in South Africa. He really spent like a lot of time and energy pursuing this cause. In fact, he spent about a third of his lifetime in prison for the service of his cause. Finally, he became the leader of South Africa, and after spending just a term in power, he exited power. But research has shown that not everyone has a similar approach to power. In fact, Maynard and Mead found, for instance, that sometimes leaders use their power for their personal interests. Now, power has effects beyond the scope of organizational behavior or management, which is typically associated with power. When you come to the domain of consumption, for instance, we know that powerful people are more selfish. They spend on themselves rather than others. We also know that when people lack power, they consume status goods to restore their sense of power, whereas when people are powerful, they look out for more practical things, consuming for utility. So across the literature, we know quite a bit about having or lacking power, but underpinning this work is the assumption that power is a singular concept that has a uniform effect on everyone, and having or lacking it is what matters. But that's not the whole story, because I've just given you examples of behavioral differences that people in power exhibit. So will a person become a Mandela, or will they become a selfish leader? Or are powerful people greedy consumers, or do they prefer quality products that last? Well, we can't really say based on existing research, hence the rationale for this paper, which is to find out why people behave in such different ways when they have power, so that with that knowledge, we'll be able to predict behaviors of powerful people. So our theory is that to understand why powerful people act the way they do, it is important to understand their motives for getting into power in the first place. So why did they seek power? What do they want power for? Or what do they want out of power? And we have some leads from research on social psychology. So modern research in social psych support insights from as far back as ancient Greece that well-being is a fundamental human motive that drives behavior. And humans have two distinct pathways to achieve this sense of well-being. So on one, they focus on maximizing pleasure and comfort while minimizing pain. And this is known as hedonia. On the other, they aim to achieve some meaningful purpose or ideal, and this is known as eudaimonia. So in our theory, we integrate this framework with power to explain the motives that drive people to seek power. So we theorize that hedonic and eudaimonic motives for power predict how people seek, experience, and react to being in power. Specifically, we propose that there are two main motives for seeking power. So first is the hedonic motive for power, which is the pursuit of power with the aim of achieving personal pleasure and comfort in a short time while exerting very minimal effort. And the second is the eudaimonic motive for power, which is the pursuit of power to grow and make a difference in the long term. So I'll note here that these motives are not orthogonal. People do not hold either one or the other. However, we believe that one motive will tend to dominate. So this is just a snapshot of the building blocks of the theory, and I can come back to it if people want to have a closer look. So based on the theory I just showed you, we went through a multi-study process to come up with the hedonic and eudaimonic motives for power scale, which we also call the HEMS. So from item generation through to the nomological level. So we used a deductive approach to generate the items. You remember the theory that I showed you earlier had some important building blocks. So for hedonic motive for power, they're looking for self-benefit, pleasure, or comfort. They rely on their feelings to assess if they are making progress, and they want things in the shortest possible time. For eudaimonic motive for power, they're looking for benefits that can be shared with others. They are looking for growth and meaning. They rely on their cognition to assess their progress, and they focus on the long-term outcomes. So the items were generated based on these dimensions. So in addition to the conceptual content of the items, the framing of the items was crucial as an element of the item generation process. So we had two considerations. So first, the scale needed to be useful in measuring people's motives for power, first of all. And this scale needs to be useful whether or not the people are currently in power or want to be in power at all. So asking people like with a past framing, such as like, why did you get into power, is not very effective. And secondly, when we look in particular at hedonic motive for power, we know that there's a self-serving dimension of it. And studies show that people are motivated to distance themselves from what they consider selfish actions. So it was really important for us to frame the items to focus on the attributes rather than on the person, so that we can get like actual measures of people's motives. So this were the instructions that we would give to participants before they answer the questions. So they were to imagine that they've been offered a position of power and that they will be able to control the outcomes of others. So what would make such a position of power desirable to them? And then they will see these items. So there's a prefix, power will be desirable if, followed by the substantive item. So for a hedonic motive for power or HMP item, they would see power will be desirable if I could get exclusive access to resources. Or power will be desirable if I could have a positive impact on others for an EMP item or eudaimonic motive for power item. So both scales were rated on a 7-point Likert scale from disagree strongly to agree strongly. Now in all, we generated 87 hedonic motive for power items and 89 items for eudaimonic motive for power. So this is a snapshot of all the items. I can always come back to it if anyone wants to have a closer look at them. Now the scale would eventually be administered to an average person. So we ran a study to make sure that people consider the items clear and easy to understand. So we collected data from Prolific, from residents of the US, UK, and Ireland. So for each item, they rated them based on these two scales. So they rated whether they were clearly worded or whether they were easy to understand. So items with a clarity and ease rating of above 6 were kept in the study. So in the end, 55 HMP items were retained and 57 EMP items were retained. The other items that did not meet their clarity criteria were dropped. Now, to know if the items were actually capturing the motives for power and not something else, we needed to do a content validation study. So we used two methods. So the first method is the orbiting scale method, where you compare the scales to other related and existing scales. Now, the purpose of this stage is not discriminant validity, which we'll get to later, but it's to ensure that people can classify the scales correctly. So we use these three scales. We use the dominance, prestige, and leadership scales, the ones from Cheng and Susan Bach. We also use the need for arousal scale, need for closure scales, and these other scales to compare with our items. So we ran this across 3 studies with a total of about 1,500 participants from prolific. Now, participants would see an item and would see the definitions of each focal skills, that's eudaimonic motive and hedonic motive, in addition to the orbiting skills, prestige, dominance, and leadership. Now, what they were supposed to do was to categorize where each item fell. So I can earn more money than other people. It's a hedonic motive for power item. Now, if they correctly classified it, then it made a cut. But if it was wrongly classified as maybe a prestige motive, then it wasn't a very good item. So items that were classed as having moderate to strong validity were retained. So these numbers are based on the number of people who correctly classified an item and the number of times an item was matched to the correct field. So these were the items that remained after this round of studies. Now, we also consulted experts for a second round of concept validation, and this method is largely used in the marketing literature. So at least 5 people with above average expertise are required to do this method. So we had 28 people with higher research degrees in psychology, marketing, and organizational behavior to do the sort, and the age range was from 18 to 67. Now, again, we defined each sub-dimension of the scale, as you can see on the screen, and it was the same matching process as the previous one. Items were mixed and participants were supposed to match the correct item to the right definition. Items that were classed as having moderate to strong validity were retained. And at this point, there were 18 HMP items and 31 EMP items. Now, we needed to confirm whether the items loaded in a manner consistent with the theory that we came up with. And so the purpose of this stage was also to cut down the number of items so that the scale is functional, concise, and internally consistent. So we again administered this to participants from prolific, and they were asked to rate their motives for power. So I conducted an EFA, and items that cross-loaded onto multiple factors or items with a factor loading of less than 0.4 were dropped. And again, using the 60% rule of thumb by Hinkin as a guide, I retained 4 factors with eigenvalues greater than 1, which accounted for about 59% of the variance in the scale. So in the end, 3 EMP items retained and 1 HMP item retained. So for the HMP dimension retained, there were 6 items, and the EMP dimension retained had 16 items. Now, sometimes when you measure a construct with a scale, what you see may be influenced by other factors, and popular ones in the literature are social desirability and affect. That's the tendency for people to present themselves in a more favorable light, or the tendency for people to report their motives based on how they currently feel. And as you would remember, I took some steps to frame the items to prevent some of these things, but there's always like prudence in doing something extra. So it was also important at this stage to demonstrate that the scale is reliable and that the factor structure that we found in the EFA was consistent. So again, participants from prolific answered this questionnaire. They received these scales in a randomized manner. So for reliability, both HMP and EMP were highly reliable with alphas and omegas above 0.8. Now we saw a correlation between the scales and positive affect, and also with HMB and impression management. So we needed to run further analysis to be sure that there were no method effects. So we used the latent variable modeling method by Potsakov, and with that we isolated each construct. We compared to 2 models, so a model with confounding factors and a baseline model without the confounding factors. We found that positive affect was a potential confound, even though impression management wasn't. And what we did, normally you control for positive affect if you're using the scale, but if you go back to our theory, you would realize that positive affect was part of the desires of people who are hedonically motivated for power. And so we felt that it was theoretically part of it and that there was no need to control for it unless authors who use it later on require it. Now we ran a CFA with Lavan and reconfirmed the factor structure. So it was 2 higher order factors, HMP and EMP, 3 sub-factors for EMP, and just 1 for HMP, consistent with what we found previously. And we compared this with just a simple 2-factor solution, and the previous model was a better fit. Now, we needed to ensure that our scale is consistent with other existing scales, but not redundant, so not useless, basically. So we expected the scale to be related to, but not redundant with other existing power scales, because it's in effect a power scale. We also expected it to be related to well-being scales, such as hedonic and eudaimonic motives for activity scale. Now, participants from Prolific answer the questionnaire again. I'll zoom in to give you a closer look at what we found. So you can see that HMP is related to using dominance as a power strategy, but EMP is not. This was the case with both dominant scales, the one by Chen and the one by Susanbach. Both scales were related to wanting to use prestige as a power strategy, so there was no difference there. Both HMP and EMP were positively linked to wanting to be in power or wanting to be a leader. So the unexpected result here was that the HMP wasn't positively related to having a general hedonic motive, and we expected that it might be related. And our rationale or explanation of this is that sometimes people can have power-specific motives that do not extend to other areas of their life. So they may have a hedonic motive for power, but not necessarily be hedonic towards other activities. So that's how we would explain this. Now, we also finally tested the relationship between our power motive scales and a wider net of outcomes to which it should be theoretically related. Now, some scales of interest were the theories of power scale. That's how people think power works. And in consumption, again, whether people were material or minimalist. Participants from Prolific took this study, and I'll give you a closer look again. So the first set of skills was the theories of power scale, which are people's perceptions about how power works. And HMP was related to having a perception that power is an oppressive tool, while EMP was related to having a notion that power is rooted in social coordination and to be used for greater good. Now, HMP is also related, highly related to the thirst for material goods, and EMP is associated with wanting to consume less, which we think will be in line with our theory. HMP was also positively associated with being manipulative. Now, after we did all these tests, we finally have a scale, and we need to be sure that a scale works. We can use it in a practical context. So we tested it with a term in the literature called temporal discounting. Now, if I offered you a choice between $100 today and $120 in 6 months, most people will choose $100 today. And the tendency to choose the smaller amount today instead of waiting for the bigger amount in future is what is known as temporal discounting. Now, there's some existing relationship between power and temporal discounting in the literature, which we found interesting, for which reason we wanted to test our skill here. So Joshi and Fast found that high power led to less temporal discounting, and people with low power tended to want things immediately. But other studies also show that this effect did not replicate, and that it depended on some circumstances, or it didn't always happen the way it was predicted. So we thought that this was fertile ground to test our study and understand the relationship between power and temporal discounting. So we predicted specifically that people high in HMP who are short-term oriented and want immediate benefits will exhibit greater discounting behavior, whereas people who are high in EMP will have a greater ability to wait because they expect that achieving something purposeful comes with costs and challenges. It wasn't clear that power will have an effect, power alone will have an effect due to the replication issues, but we thought that it was worth exploring. Perhaps high power leads to lower discounting, but only for HMP, but not for EMP. So we ran an exploratory test here. Again, we recruited participants from Prolific to answer this questionnaire. Participants received a power motivation, a power manipulation, the classic Galinsky power manipulation, which is to write about a time where you had high power or a time where you had low power, or write about what you did last weekend as a control condition. Then participants were told that in addition to the income that they would earn from the study, they had a chance to earn extra money through a bonus draw. And we emphasize that we really do pay out the money, so the choices would affect what they would get if they won. So they were given these choices separately in this order. So they either received $5 today or $4 in 3 weeks, up to, for the ninth time, $5 today versus $12 in 3 weeks. And for each of these options, they had to make a choice. Now, if by the ninth options you are still choosing $5 today, then you have a very high rate of discounting because the amount is higher in the future. But if you choose a future amount by option 3, then you have a low rate of discounting. Now, choosing a smaller amount in future or the same amount in future wasn't rational, so participants who made that choice were eliminated from the analysis. So for the study design, the temporal discounting task and the scales were randomized so that there are no other effects. So we found that in line with our hypothesis, participants who were high in HMP had a higher rate of temporal discounting, showing a greater preference for immediate rewards. There was no support for the second predictions that people high in EMP did not discount less. So it seems that HMP had greater power in predicting temporal discounting, but not EMP. And we ran the exploratory test testing the basic effect, which is whether high versus low power predicts temporal discounting. And similar to the other replication study, we didn't find an effect, and there was also no interaction with our scales. So in all, we found that HMP particularly predicts temporal discounting, which gives some credence to our scales. And we think that this will be important in consumer financial decision-making context, which is important to me because I'm a consumer researcher. Now, overall, there are a few limitations of the scale development process, which is that it was mostly online studies because it was during the time of COVID, and it was mostly with Western participants. And so it would have been interesting to find out if people from other cultures had different experiences. So thank you so much for your attention, and I would welcome any suggestions or questions to improve the paper. Thank you.
So I will moderate the discussion. Now, does anyone has questions? Or are there some questions online? How can you? So, shall I read it? So it's from the previous talks, the question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Want to read the question? The previous question.
So then, Didi, I do have a question.
Okay.
So you found that the hedonic power motive is positively related to the late theories of the coercive late theories of power, and also to the dominance subscale of the Süßenbach scale. But you found a negative correlation with impression management, right?
Sorry.
So you found a negative correlation with impression management between the hedonic power motive scale, yeah?
Yeah, so I'll take it back.
Yes. Yeah, I wondered how you explain it, because so like dominant people who strive for dominance for their own pleasure, to have more like a coercive late theory of power, they want to make a good impression, to be competent, even if they are not actually competent. So I would expect a positive correlation with impression management. How could we explain this finding?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Yes, we actually thought that people high in HMP would be more likely to manage impression. So this was strange to us, which was why we tried to probe the interaction, and we found that it wasn't actually substantial when we did the latent variable modeling. And so even though it had a negative correlation here, it did not matter when we compared the two models. So in effect, the correlation wasn't significant.
Okay, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have one question. Please let us know if you can hear it.
Yeah.
It's I'm just interested in the application aspect with consumer financial decision making.
Do you understand?
Did you hear it?
Yes. Can you please repeat yourself? Sorry, I missed what you said. Yeah.
I'm interested in the application case that you made right at the end with HMP and consumer financial decision making.
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, power actually has an effect on consumers. And I showed you some previous studies that have shown that people make consumption decisions based on how powerful they feel or how little power they feel. And I thought that it was interesting to study this in the context of consumers. And so when you look at temporal discounting, it involves making decisions about money, which is a consumption focused subject. And so I thought that it was possible to extend this into financial decision making. And so if a consumer made decisions based on their motive for power. So for instance, if you have a hedonic motive for power and you tend to want things right now, you may be more prone to making decisions that are less than optimal. So if you have a high rate of discounting, you tend not to save a lot, and this will affect your future financial prospects. And I thought that that was really important to highlight being a consumer researcher.
Fine.
So thumbs up.
Okay.
So do we have some more questions? Okay, then so thank you, Didi. And yeah, then we continue with the last talk. Okay, yes. So now the third talk. So together with my colleagues Astrid Schütz from University of Bamberg and Jen Overbeck from Melbourne Business School, we did a review paper on how to measure the vertical dimension of relationships and overview of self-report measures on dominance, prestige, status, and power. So our aim of the review was to provide an exhaustive overview of self and peer report scales on power, dominance, status, and prestige. And first, we wanted to establish consensus regarding core hierarchy terms. Then we wanted to provide a narrative list of all scales that are available. And then we provide some factor analytical results to show similarities as well as differences between hierarchy scales. So what is a vertical dimension of relationships as opposed to the horizontal dimension, which is about warmth? The vertical dimension is about hierarchical differences, and concepts such as power and status are relevant here. Most research on the vertical dimension have used self-report measures, and this does not wonder because the perception of hierarchies is by definition subjective, and the subjective experience is central to psychology. This is also why we focused on self-report scales. So there are some serious issues with measures on the vertical dimension. Because of this issue, we have only limited comparability of findings within and between studies. There are 4 reasons. First, researchers use different scales in addressing one variable. Second, researchers use one scale in aiming to measure different variables. Third, hierarchy concepts are used interchangeably. And fourth, researchers use a term for a specific hierarchy variable, but operationalize it with a measure that taps into another hierarchy concept. For example, there's a questionnaire called Couples Dominance Questionnaire. This scale measures decision-making power in the context of romantic relationships. However, decision-making power is defined as power as potential influence and not as dominant. So researchers who may use the scale may conclude that dominance is associated with a certain outcome. However, they actually measured power and not dominance. For some of these shortcomings, specific names exist. General fallacy, this means that two distinct constructs have the same name. And general fallacy means that two constructs are identical but are titled differently. These fallacies exist at the construct and the measurement level, which is why we first wanted to tackle these issues on the construct level. So we provided definitions of all core hierarchy variables and followed influential work. We divided power in two forms. First as power as potential influence and power as resource or outcome control. Some definitions or scales include both aspects of power. Importantly, we focus on social power. This means power over others and not on personal power. Personal power is about concepts such as agency, self-efficacy, or internal locus of control. So to control one's actions, but not to have power over others. The second variable is status. Status can be understood as respect and esteem in the eyes of others. And it can also be understood as social rank in a hierarchy. The most prominent example is the socioeconomic status, which consists of income, job position, and education. Then we have dominance. Dominance also can be divided into two different constructs. The first is coercive dominance. This means dominance as a strategy to achieve social rank through coercion, intimidation, and aggression. Dominance can also be understood as a stable personality trait that is characterized by agentic, forceful, and assertive behavior. And for prestige, we have only one form. Prestige is like coercive dominance, a strategy to achieve high social rank. However, prestige is socially desirable because people are respected due to their superior skills, expertise, and abilities. All these hierarchy concepts also feature motives. So we have the power motive. This is a wish to influence other people and to control resources. We have the status motive. This is a wish to be respected in the eyes of others and have a high social rank. The dominance motive, the wish to be the dominating person in an interaction. And the prestige motive, this is a wish to be admired for superior skills and expertise. After providing these definitions, we did literature search through July 2023. We scanned 5 databases: Business Source Ultimate, ERIC, PsycArticles, PsycInfo, and PsyIndex. On the slide, you can see our keywords. In addition, we contacted 29 leading researchers in the field regarding non-published hierarchy scales, and we scanned 3 large test archives to also identify additional scales. So here you can see our Prisma flowchart diagram. So we scanned over 15,000 potentially relevant reports. We excluded reports that were qualitative or had children younger than 6 years. And then we screened 10,000 reports. Of these, 174 reports were assessed for eligibility. Many of them were not about a scale validation, or they did not focus on a hierarchy variable, or they measured power status on a collective level. For example, we excluded social dominance orientation or power as value, and we were left with 43 reports. And we found also 18 additional reports because we read reference lists of the full text articles and contacted the authors in the previous step. So the final review included 61 hierarchy scales. So don't worry, I will not present you all these scales now. I will only briefly show you what we did with these scales. So we created a very large table. In this table, you can see in the first column the construct. For example, here you can see power, and then the first instrument, this personal sense of power scale by Anderson and colleagues, 2012. This scale has a general and relationship specific instruction, so you can measure power in comparison with all other relevant persons, or in comparison with your romantic relationship partner, in comparison with your work colleague, and so on. And then we provide a quality score of each scale. The quality score could range from 0 to 7. So we ranked 7 criteria. The plus means 1 point, minus 0 point, plus and minus would be 0.5 points. And these are the 7 criteria. So the first is content validity, who the authors provide some definition of what their hierarchy scale measures. Other items do they show face validity. And this is the case with the sense of power scale. The scale is about the ability to influence. Then the second criterion is availability. Are the items freely available? It's also the case with the sense of power scale. The scale has 8 items. The sample item is in my relationships with others. My wishes do not carry much weight, reflecting low sense of power. Then we had 2 criteria for reliability. First, internal consistency. Is it larger than 0.7? And stability. Is it larger than 0.5 over a period of at least 1 month? And then we had 3 criteria for validity. The first is item generation, who the authors describe their scale development process. For example, they had a large item pool and they reduced the number of items based on item statistics. Then formal analysis. This is about did the authors provide some test of construct validity, for example, exploratory or confirmatory factor analysis, measurement invariance or measurement equivalence analysis. And relations with other variables is about nomological validity. Did the author provide tests for nomological validity, and were the findings also in line with their hypotheses? In addition, we also provide a summary of in which languages the scale is validated. For example, the center of power scale is validated not only in English, but also in German, Italian, and Spanish. And we uploaded the scale on the table on the following link, social hierarchy scales.github.io, because we aim to have this table always up to date. So if researchers publish a new scale, then we can add the scale in the table. And also if the criteria change, for example, if researchers notice, okay, the internal consistency of the sense of power scale proves not to be good, then we can also change the criteria in the table. And as a final step, we conducted an empirical study. As in the previous talks, we also used prolific. We recruited almost 800 prolific workers, 50% male. They were mostly from the United Kingdom, 40 years on average. And these completed 13 self-report scales and 3 peer report scales on hierarchy. First, we had a confirmatory approach. So we tested the reliabilities and the model fit of the single scales. And in the second step, we had an exploratory approach. So we grouped the self-report scales by construct, power status, dominance, and prestige. Then we decided how many factors should be extracted in each scale. We had 5 criteria: Ulysses map test, pulse CAF. We conducted a series of exploratory factor analysis with a different number of factors and examined the SEAs. And we conducted the empirical Kaiser criterion and parallel analysis. And after establishing how many factors should be extracted, we computed for each construct an exploratory factor analysis with maximum likelihood estimation and pro-max rotation. So this is how the results look like. This is an example for power. Here you can see all the power items that were subjected to the single EFA. These are from 4 different scales. This scale has 2 subscales, so in total 5 different scales were subjected to this EFA, and 3 factors were extracted, and you can also see the commonalities. I will only provide you a short summary of these results now. For power, 5 subscales were submitted to the EFA, and we extracted 3 factors. And the first factor was about power's potential influence, the second factor about the power motive, the third factor about power's resource control, with a strong focus on work because the scale was a work-related power scale. With status, we also submitted 5 subscales to the EFA. 3 factors were extracted. The first factor was about esteem and respect in the eyes of observers. The second factor was about social rank, and the third factor was about status motive. So far, these factors that emerged fit nicely with our theoretical distinction between the different forms of power and status. With prestige, we had 4 subscales. 3 factors were extracted. The first factor was about expert knowledge, unique abilities, and achievement. The second factor was about respect, admiration, and likability. And the third factor was about the prestige motive. However, we only expected 2 factors for prestige, so prestige is strategy and the prestige motive, but we found that the strategy factor is divided into 2 components. So the first factor, expert knowledge, may reflect what we actually understand under prestige. The second factor is more similar to status. However, the first and the second factor were very highly correlated, 0.74. So they could also be merged to one single factor. And then we have prestige as strategy and prestige as motive. Yeah, so far the results looked very in line with what we expected in the theory. However, for dominance, the results were not as clear. We submitted 7 subscales to the EFA, 6 factors were extracted. The first factor was about coercive dominance. This is dominance as a strategy to achieve social rank through intimidation, coercion, and aggression. The second factor is authority. Items of the dominance scale of the personality research form loaded on that factor. It was about control and leadership. Then we also had another factor that was somewhat similar. We call it agentic dominance. This is about agentic, assertive, and confident behavior. The adjectives of the interpersonal adjective scale by Wickens loaded on that factor. And then we also had 3 other factors: challenging other people, intimidation, and outperforming others. So the factor analytical results matched very well with our conceptual distinction of core hierarchy variables, at least for power, status, and prestige. However, dominance produced 6 factors. This could be explained because dominance is often confounded with other constructs. And we also found that the motives were not as fine-tuned as the traits. For example, the stative motive did not clearly distinguish between the wish to be respected and admired in the eyes of observers and the wish to have a high societal position. In the literature search, we found a huge number of self and peer report verticality scales. For power scales, they were mostly focused on romance or work. The dominance scales were mostly general, but some dominance scales were also had a contact relationship for romantic couples. The status scales were mostly general, but some status scales focused on the work context, and for prestige, only general measures existed. So an avenue for future research may be to develop more context-specific measures, for example, prestige at work, in the romantic relationship, or also in school settings. At the end, in our paper, we also provide some recommendations how to improve measurement practice in social hierarchy research. First, the name of a specific scale does not necessarily reflect the hierarchy concept that the items address. Therefore, researchers should examine the definitions by the scale authors and the item content prior to using a specific hierarchy scale. It would also help to define the target construct and identify the theoretical background to ensure that the selected scale matches with the definition. If the psychometric properties are questionable or unknown, then the researchers should provide some evidence of reliability and good model fit. We also found that longer hierarchy scales often mix several hierarchy terms. So the use of shorter scales can have the advantage that hierarchy terms are not conflated. And also the use of more recently developed scales has the advantage that the scales more likely reflect the distinction between hierarchy concepts as in current research, and the evidence that the scale scores are valid and reliable is more up to date. Yeah, I also have here the link of our table with all the scales on the slide and my contact details. Thank you so much for your attention.